So this is our second Johnson snippet. Remember last time I talked about Barry Goldwater getting the nomination. Goldwater, he's very, very aggressive, and Johnson's polling suggests that a lot of suburban Republicans, especially suburban women, Republican women, mothers, are concerned that that Goldwater seems almost cavalier about using nuclear weapons. He gives an interview talking about how he'd kind of like to be president because then he could lob a nuclear bomb into the men's room of the Kremlin. I mean, it's this does not poll particularly well, and the result is and it's one of these extraordinary ironies given what we'll see from Johnson in his full term. Johnson runs as the peace candidate in 1964 because peace actually polls well. He promises he will not send American boys, his word, to fight a war that Asian boys should be fighting. Again, his word, that and people seem receptive to the idea. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of public pressure on him to escalate the war in Vietnam. He also runs what may be the single most famous TV advertisement in any presidential election campaign. It runs only once. It's so negative that everyone sort of talks about it, and it sort of achieves Johnson's purpose. So here's the ad. It's sometimes called the Daisy ad.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 6, 8, 9,
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. These are the stakes. To make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other, or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
So yeah, the implication is, if Barry Goldwater gets elected, he's gonna blow up the world. And Johnson wins overwhelmingly in 1964. He carries everything except for Goldwater's home state, and 5 states of the Deep South, a backlash caused by his support of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He almost certainly, if he had wanted to, could have used the mandate from this election to begin to scale back the conflict in Vietnam. But again, Johnson's goal was domestic. He had a Voting Rights Act he wanted to pass. He had an expansion of the welfare state. He was worried that if he also drew down the involvement in Vietnam, one of the effects would be that it would solidify conservative opposition to his administration and prevent him from doing his domestic agenda. So his choice was basically to do both. The saying at the time was that Johnson wanted guns and butter. So guns for the war, butter was the social program and voting rights, and this turned out to be a disastrous choice. So in the spring of 1965, as the situation in South Vietnam continues to deteriorate, the military basically comes to him and says, "Look, we need more troops. We need a broadened military force." They say they're confident they can win the war, although exactly what winning the war is going to entail, they never quite explain. The result is an expansion militarily of the war to Laos, this bombing campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder. You can kind of get a sense of where the U.S. is targeting. Laos, again, was a neutral country, and a dramatic expansion of U.S. Military on the ground. So an explosion of U.S. troops will be more than 500,000 in early 1968, and you can see the dramatically increasing number of U.S. deaths on the chart over there on the right. And one of the problems for Johnson is that Johnson is kind of stuck in a trap of his own making. His policy is going to be that he'll do the minimum possible to maintain the independence and integrity of the South Vietnamese regime. But as the South Vietnamese regime devolves into basically a U.S. puppet regime, by 66 or 67, the minimum possible requires massive numbers of U.S. troops. There is a draft at this point, so these are people who are being conscripted into the Army. The draft, intriguingly, does not apply to college students. At least at this point in time, this is at a period where far fewer Americans are going to college than is today. Johnson's policies ultimately divide the Democratic Party, and a kind of liberal critique emerges. And the best example of this comes in nationally televised hearings in 1966, chaired by this man, William Fulbright, who was a Democratic senator from Arkansas. And Fulbright brings government officials, Maxwell Taylor, the then U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, and they're grilled by members of the committee, several quite liberal Democrats on the committee, and they don't really have great answers, and so the hearings cause problems for the administration. Johnson is very angry at this. He had been a friend of Fulbright's when they both served in the Senate. Johnson takes to recalling Harry Truman's previous description of Fulbright, that his name is really Senator Half-Bright. Again, Johnson doesn't like being criticized. One of the few Democrats on the committee who backed the administration at this point, although he'll later change his mind, was a Minnesota senator named Eugene McCarthy. And in the middle of the hearings, Johnson calls up McCarthy to sort of complain about what's going on and give a kind of woe is me statement, complaining about his difficulties. So here's that clip.
What they really think is we ought to be there and we ought to get out. Well, I know we ought to be there, but I can't get out. I just can't be the architect of surrender. And don't see, I'm trying every way in the world I can to find a way to thing. But they don't have the pressure that will bring them to the table as of yet. We don't know whether they ever will. I'm willing to do damn near anything. If I told you what I was willing to do, I wouldn't have any program. Dirksen wouldn't give me $1 to operate the war. I just can't operate in a glass bowl with all these things, but I'm willing to do nearly anything the human can do if I can do it with any honor at all. But they started with me on Jim, you remember. Yeah. He was corrupt and he ought to be killed, so we killed him. We all got together and got a goddamn bunch of thugs, and we went in and assassinated him. Now, we really had no political stability since then.
Again, the credibility gap. Johnson's saying, I know we oughtn't to be there, but I just can't get out. And then this line about how we assassinated the leader of South Vietnam. Here, ironically, Johnson is overstating what the U.S. did. The U.S. authorized the coup, which led to the assassination, but U.S. didn't actually, America didn't actually pull the trigger. But at the time, publicly, the administration is saying the war is going well, the U.S. is backing democracy. So this idea of basically lying to the public, eventually there'll be a very, very significant price to pay for this in terms of U.S. credibility on foreign policy issues. So this conversation is occurring in the spring of 1966. So we're moving towards several 100,000 U.S. troops on the ground. And the stagnation of the war leads to a decline in Johnson's approval rating, which was unbelievably high in the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination, but begins to go down in 65, down further in 66, further still in 67. It's basically just a steady decline, undermined not entirely by the war. There were urban riots also in 67 and 68 that really do a number on Johnson's approval rating, but the war is a critical aspect, in part because Johnson is facing increasing resistance from young Americans, from liberals, from the Democratic base as a whole. So the Democrats are divided, the Republicans are at least somewhat more unified. One other thing about this kind of middle period of Johnson's presidency, 65, 66, Europe becomes also much more difficult to deal with. Khrushchev is pushed out in 1964. A three-person triumvirate takes over in South Vietnam, in Soviet Union. the nominal head is a guy named Alexei Kosygin, who we'll encounter in the next snippet. But the real powers lay in Brezhnev, who eventually will emerge as the sole leader of the Soviet Union later in the 1960s. Unlike Khrushchev, Brezhnev is a hardliner. It's difficult for Johnson to deal with the administration. And then late in his time in office, Charles de Gaulle, who will leave office in 1968, de Gaulle decides that he's had enough of sort of France not being treated as a great power. France isn't treated as a great power because at this point they're no longer a great power, but this is not the case in de Gaulle's mind. And de Gaulle in 1966 announces that he's going to, that France is not going to be a member of NATO anymore. He wants US bases out, withdrawn from all American soldiers out of French soil. And that France will be a kind of third power between the United States and the Soviet Union. Johnson goes along with this, and ultimately the French withdrawal from NATO doesn't have major complications. But at the time, there is this sense that the administration is kind of losing its position in the Cold War. So Vietnam is going bad. We have these difficulties in Europe. Johnson also sends troops to the Dominican Republic in 1965 to back a military government there. So by 1966, early 1967, there's this sense of a kind of stagnating, unimaginative, hardline foreign policy, and Johnson's approval rating is suffering as a result. And that will lead us to the third snippets.